Hello and welcome to our version of African Voices platform. Today we have our guest, Dr. Anita Franklin, and my colleague Chihana. Hi, Tchiyiwe.
Good evening, Enoch. Thanks so much for organizing this show today. And Dr. Anita Franklin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to contribute, because this is such an important moment, isn't it? For both the US and the UK.
Absolutely. And in our show tonight, we're talking about the verdict which came up recent of the George Floyd murder. We just wanted to touch on a few areas of this justice process. And Dr. Anita, you are an African American. You are well aware of the whole justice process and the injustices that's happened down the years. What did you make of this verdict?
I was relieved that common sense had prevailed. I think that one of the things that has been really important about this case is that it was, in the words of a Black British filmmaker, Ishmael Blagrove, it was a snuff movie. Everybody saw it. It was a snuff film. And it was shown over and over and over again. 9 minutes and 26 seconds, okay, of daylight robbery. And so one of the things is that you cannot help but wonder at all of the other deaths, all of the other grim, humiliating deaths that have taken place, at the behest of a police officer, policing in Black, brown, marginalized, for instance, Native American communities. That's what it makes you think about. I think that President Biden said that this was a start. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that's kind of where it is. That's all it is a start. That's all it is. It's nothing else, because this was atypical. It was atypical. For hundreds of years, Black police have routinely laughed. Okay, I'm not making that up. I'm talking about a real deal case here. Police laughing at the justice system, because there will be no justice. If white police decide to kill Black people, boom, that's okay. And, white police also kill white people too. There was the case of Justine Damond, but the disproportionate number of unarmed killings is Black, brown, Native American people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely, we cannot say that this has happened in isolation, and you've well articulated that by highlighting some of the other killings of people in the United States by the police. There's also the aspect of how the public responds to these crimes as well. We've seen a rise in people asking for the reason why, as opposed to challenging the fact that people are being killed in that manner. Is this a trend that we're going to be seeing, especially when it comes to Black people being killed, not just in the United States, but across the globe? There's always the question of, but why was he killed? And people are looking to trial the people who have actually been killed, as we've noticed in the case of George Floyd.
Well, I think that what you're dealing with in the American situation, I'm going to just stick with that right now, is you're dealing with the kind of hyper individualistic stuff that goes on. There's a tendency that everything is in some sense your own individual fault. And so if you get sick with whatever, that's your individual fault. If you're poor, it's your individual fault. There is a lack of thinking about stuff in a social kind of way, which having lived in other countries, having been privileged enough to live and travel in other countries, I am able to say that as an American, that Americans, as a general rule, have kind of abdicated thinking socially. You have to almost be an intellectual before, before you start thinking about things like public health. It's like people are like, what do you mean public health? It's like, is that the doctor across the road? Is that public health? So I think that one of the things is that we have a culture in the US which is about that whole individual thing. And so therefore, if a police person has killed someone, it must be that person who's been killed has automatically done something. You must have done something because, so the fact that actually you are in a neighborhood that is over policed, by virtue of the fact that these are all poor people, and it's easy to over police poor people because they don't have any political voice and they don't have any economic clout. That's the nature of them being poor. So the police have nothing better to do but to make sure that they are over policing in these places. The other thing is that in the US, and this is kind of allied to it, is if a child does something in school, do you know that in many parts of the US they call the police? So like one child hit another child and you look up and your child is in handcuffs. Now, that's crazy. That just doesn't make any sense. And yet, over time, that is where we are. It didn't used to be like that. But over time, this is what has begun to happen, is that the police are called in for every little thing that somebody else doesn't want to deal with. So this child hit me. I'm a teacher. I'm a grown-up, but this child hit me, pulled my hair or whatever, and there's nothing else I can do. So I've called the police. And so then the child already, age 5, age 7, age 9, becoming criminalized. And this is, of course, disproportionately happening to Black, brown, poor children. So we have a real problem in the US in that police are called for really small things, and then they're called for really big things. And in the meantime, they're trained to act like everything is a potential ambush.
Yeah, thank you.
Did I answer your question about the individual stuff? Because that's the thing. It's all kind of individual. Yeah. In the meantime, the police are always acting like everything is an ambush or a potential ambush of them.
No, you absolutely did. And I think what you inherently alluded to without actually saying it is the systemic nature of the current circumstances that Black and brown people are faced with. I'm going to let Enoch pick up from there because I would like to bring that back a little to the United Kingdom when we've talked a bit more about the George Floyd situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Dr. Anita. Looking back at this George Floyd case, going forward, do we think that this could set a precedent to any future cases where white policemen have murdered African Americans? And more so in America, we've seen this happen in the past. I mean, what's his name, Garner, in New York, pretty much similar case to George Floyd. But he was not prosecuted, the officer involved in the murder.
Yes.
He was not prosecuted. He was sacked from the police force.
Yes.
Right. So could this case of George Floyd set any future precedent? Maybe, or perhaps as President Biden mentioned that this is only a start. Could this be maybe put, all these other officers in check?
I think that it could. I think that what is more hopeful is the Justice and Policing Act. And if that Justice and Policing Act, which was put forward by the Democrats in the House of Representatives, if we could get that to be passed in the Senate, and I know that's a big if, given the power powerfulness of the GOP, of the Republicans at the moment, we would actually be on the road to doing something systemically that could be helpful. The Justice and Policing Act has been passed by the House. Yeah. And so we will see if, for instance, this administration can use this moment to really push for the Justice in Policing Act. The Justice in Policing Act, I just want to say, just to summarize, does a number of things that would be helpful. One of the things is that it's about having greater accountability for police misconduct. It's about making sure that there's proper data collection around all of this kind of stuff, all of these kinds of stops and what have you. There's something about making sure that there's federal oversight of police misconduct and the excessive use of force. The Justice and Police Act also makes it a little bit easier to convict police, because right now they have a kind of, they have a certain amount of immunity. But the other thing that this act will do is it limits their immunity to, for instance, civil prosecutions. This is the thing about America. You hit people in their pocketbook, they listen. They don't listen to moral stuff. They're not interested. But you hit people in their pocketbook. And so the more that these guys these murderers end up being sued, and they could be sued by not only the victims' families, maybe they start getting sued by the city of Minneapolis, for example. These are the kinds of things that will begin to make a difference. The other thing that this particular act could do is it would give the Department of Justice the ability to issue subpoenas to departments that are caught up in a pattern of discrimination. So you see, those are a lot of things that don't happen now, but what could happen if this particular bit of legislation were to be passed by the Senate.
Right. Thank you. I mean, yes, definitely. I think you make a very big point about how the capitalist nature of responding is what seems to work, and the human aspect of it has just been thrown out the window, I suppose.
It's disgusting, Chewy, isn't it? It just really lets you know. We're dealing with in terms of the Republican Party and the overall Republican nature of the country, because right. In some ways, when you look at the voter suppression bills that are going on in the United States, you'll find that they're all over the country. It's not just, it's quite extraordinary to see. Once upon a time, voter suppression was something that you thought about in relation to the southern states, states that used to have slavery. And now we got voter suppression all up in Washington State, all up in Oregon, and you know what I mean? It's it's all over the country. So one of the things is to understand that we're really up against, how would I put it? We're up against a kind of politics which is not just about voter suppression. It's about citizenship suppression.
Right. Yeah.
It's about changing the nature of what a full citizen is entitled to. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, Anita and Enoch as well, what the George Floyd murder that we all watched before our very televisions, everybody in the world was engaged with this because we saw exactly what happened. A lot of cases nonetheless are not visible. They're not in front of the camera, and we've lost a lot of people in similar manner. And this is across the world. On the back of that, the world rose to protest. Despite the pandemic, there were lots of protests, especially those that were led by the Black Lives Matter movement. And very specifically here in the UK, the government decided that they wanted to investigate what the race disparities were in the UK on the back of those protests. The report that has since been compiled has been condemned widely because of its undermining of institutional racism in the United Kingdom. And the government also saying that the problems that they actually think are more crucial are the ones around poverty rather than race in this country. Have you had a comment? Have you had a thought about that? And what is the link?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is the importation of ideas. You see, I think I think we in the United Kingdom need to be careful about importing ideas from the United States, because the United States is not a role model for race relations. So it is the last place. I would say that this report reflects the importation of particular kinds of ideas around individual responsibility for your situation, that kind of.
Can I clarify something there for viewers and for myself as well? Which importation are we tackling here? Is it importation of government approach or importation of protesting approach?
The importation of the individual responsibility for what is going on for you and your family. This idea, again, that we can no longer in this country think socially about things, right, but that instead what's happening is a breaking down of everybody right, into individual, how would I put it, individual people. We're just all individuals, and and this idea that we are responsible for our own individual situation, that there's no such thing as society, and this is, of course, going back to Mrs. Thatcher, isn't it? There was no such thing as society, only families for her. And so that's what's going on in that race report. They're trying to say there's nothing here to do with race. It's more to do with individuals working hard, playing by a certain set of rules. And if you do all of that, you'll be fine. That, this idea of talking about institutional racism is, it's like it's a fraud. And what makes it worse, of course, is that you have Black Tories who are prepared to co-sign those statements, if they haven't actually written them themselves. And that's one of the things that has, happened in the UK, is that you have a very ethnically diverse cabinet under Boris Johnson, but none of them are, in terms of the ethnic minorities in there, are prepared to speak about racism, not even about personal prejudice. What you hear about is, oh, it's actually my own community that tried to hold me back. You get those kinds of statements. And so in that sense, what we have in Britain is we don't have a lot of high profile Black leadership, which is going to help us make forward strides around this. You see, the thing is, in the US, you do have Black Republicans, but they're not given the limelight in the way that, maybe we don't take them seriously. Maybe that's the thing. Who took Ben Carson seriously? Nobody took them seriously. But in this country, you have people in really important positions like Kemi Badenoch and like, what's his name? Kwatang, all of these guys, these people, Priti Patel, hey, they have a lot of power and they are using it to dampen down any critique of British racism.
Absolutely. And I mean, it would be remiss of us to mention that Colin Powell in the United States he is Republican, is he not? And he had risen to certain levels of power.
But he's not. He's a former general, but he never was, for instance, a part of Trump's administration.
Okay, so which we see is very much
always anti-Trump. Yeah, he's a never Trumper.
All right. So the thing that you've been pointing to again, the United Nations Working Group yesterday on looking at this. So yesterday they too came up with very similar conclusions, and they also say the report itself blamed single parents for poor outcomes. I think that's alluding to the family concept that you were talking to, and that racism was either a product of the imagination of people of African descent or of discrete individualized incidents. How on earth do we navigate that? Because it's our own people who were part of that reporting that compiled this report and said that. What do we do? How do we navigate these challenges? Because they've taken us many years back, I think.
Well, where they've taken you back to, again, I said, is this business of the importation of American ideas. When I was a child, and that's a long time ago, sweetheart, there was a really important report called the Moynihan Report. And the Moynihan Report was a piece of sociology that basically blamed Black women.
All right.
Because there were too many Black women who were single parents. And on the back of that, you began to have all of these ideas that came up later. It got repeated with Reagan. So like, I'm a kid and this is like, what? Nixon and Johnson, those like the 60s, 70s. And then you get Reagan in 79. And he's talking about welfare queens, and now those ideas are sitting here in Britain, where it's going to be the fault of single parents, and they are always Black. So even though you've got Asian people suffering. And when I say Asian people, I'm talking about people of East Asian and South Asian communities suffering. These women from Bangladesh are suffering. Yeah, but they'll always put it on us because apparently, we become a useful trope for talking about this kind of stuff. We've become a symbol of something. We could sit here and not say anything. It would still be our fault. You know what I mean? And I think that it's, in some sense, because we have protested, it's kind of like the fact of our protest is used against us. Yeah. And so that brings us to the next bit of what's been going on, which is legislation to inhibit protest. Let's connect that particular bit of legislation coming at the time that it's coming. That stuff is not actually about Sarah Everard and the vigil. That was actually more about the Bristol stuff and the statues. Okay.
Right. I think coming on to what my colleague Chihana mentioned about, actually Suda just pointed out the importation of these ideas. We clearly know that the UK is the architect of these ideas, which ended up in America. Now they're coming back to the UK. And we know very well that the authors of this report, I think, is Dr. Sewell? the chair of this report. I mean, we've had a few people trying to come back, do some comments about it and saying, oh, they're so disappointed that the majority people from the BEM background aren't agreeing with what they wrote in this report. There's this lady, the scientist, Dr. Anna Pocock, I think that's her name, part of the authoring of this report. She clearly mentioned that she doesn't believe there is institutional racism, but when we go back to the Macpherson report, you know, that is something else that pops up and mentions institutional racism in this country. You know, we don't even have to mention Stephen Lawrence, you know, the lessons from Stephen Lawrence, all that alluded to institutional racism. Now, the Black Tories, as you mentioned earlier on, to me, they don't represent the ideals of the majority of Black people in the UK. I think there's only a small circle of people right higher up in the hierarchy that are not up to date with their own situations currently. I mean, who could ignore or forget Black Lives Matter movement that's been going on from last year? All that alone could highlight and identify all these issues. So I just want to understand, you know, or even our viewers, to really get to know where did these ideas come from, or where did these authors bring these ideas that there were no institutional racism in the UK?
Well, I just think that what you have to take into account is that these people were trying to do something, first of all, that was really quick. And they were trying to do something that was pleasing to the people who were paying them. It's really important to understand that a lot of people who are cited in that report did not consent to their names and their views being put in that report. So that's the thing. I mean, for me, I just think the whole thing is a tissue of lies, and is kind of like a click and paste. I don't know, no, cut and paste of various kinds of things. I've never seen anything happen so quickly as this particular report. It was unnecessary because we do have loads and loads of different reports which have happened over the course of the years under many different governments, different, kinds of governments. What we have is a failure on the part of this particular government to be interested in those previous reports. That's the thing. They don't want to look at the Lamy report, No. So that's the thing. We actually have in this country a number of different reports, campaigns. Black British people have their own history to be looking at and becoming familiar with, and it's actually distinctive, and it's really important to say, okay, yeah, we can make comparisons with the U.S., but it in many ways it's not the exact same thing. For one thing, thank God, you don't have police routinely armed. And so that, just the fact of not having the same sort of gun culture makes a difference. The American culture around race and guns took place within a society that's characterized by pioneering, cowboys, the idea of the frontier. Yeah. So that's a particular kind of environment that's created the kind of chaos that you see in the US today. The British stuff is all very colonial. Mm-hmm. And that is where you're going to see, where things get really, really revealed. It's not to say one thing is better or one thing's worse or any of those kind of things. It's just about understanding the specificity of it, because your organizations in this country will need to do something in a different way from how organizations in the US will do things. Your organizations will have different histories and may have slightly different agendas. So for example, in the US, there is definitely going to be an agenda about police violence and excessive force kind of stuff. Whereas in this country, it's more wrapped up about what's happening in custody. What happens to people in custody is huge, huge stuff, you know. Both countries actually have a problem when it comes to maternal mortality amongst Black women. Both countries have a problem with over-incarceration. The UK has a real problem with the whole business of promotion. You know, people get jobs, but often they're not promoted. And often people think that America is better because they think, oh, well, in America, I'll get promoted. And it's like, oh, yeah, well, fine, you'll get promoted, but your child will be shot down in the street because you didn't think to look at where you were moving to, you know, to get your promotion.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just get real.
No. Those are very important parallels to draw, because this is important. Otherwise, there's no one silver bullet that could resolve these issues in the same way. We have to approach them very tactfully to understand how we are here. Might be very similar, but the approaches should be different. So just for our viewers, in case you're just joining us, we're recording this show on the back of the George Floyd murder trial, in which George Floyd, the police officer, what's his name? Derek Chauvin, the police officer who killed George Floyd, was found guilty over his murder. And the context to that is we wanted to explore what that meant. And we've got a guest from the United States who is resident in the United Kingdom, Dr. Anita Franklin, who is unpicking that for us. So to just get back to that, that sort of initial conversation we were having, the what next kind of area. So there's a possibility that this case could be appealed, and the grounds of appeal that have been forwarded so far, and these are presumptively, not necessarily that I know whether the appeal has been made, but one of the grounds of appeal is that the case had been given huge publicity, of course, with all the protests around the world and locally in the United States. But also, the presiding judge, Peter Cahill, also said that the public comments that were made by Congresswoman Maxine Waters, I think she said something to the effect of stay on the street and get more confrontational if Chauvin is acquitted. So those are some of the grounds of appeal that they're looking at. What's the likelihood that this could progress? Where do you think we stand there?
If Congresswoman Maxine Waters had said nothing, they would still be appealing. Okay, but this whole thing is again trying to blame a Black woman. Yeah,
I feel like that, Anita, and I'm wondering whether I'm just taking it to. But I do think I'm trying to put my logical head on. But I do feel like that. This is very much a burden that's being placed on Black women yet again.
Exactly, we do. This is the thing that's happening over and over again. But the fact is, this case, these lawyers, his lawyers, would already be looking to appeal this because they could feel the wind. Yeah. This was not a jury that was intimidated by the police or bought by the police or frightened. You see, this is one of the things that made it different. You know, there are a number of things that made this case different. So one of the things that made this case different is no police officer testified for him. All of his colleagues testified against him. They could not find anything in the medical testimony. Again, they could not do that. So they couldn't say, oh, well, you know, he had this. The other thing is that the jury, generally in the US, an American jury gives the police the benefit of the doubt, because there's always this, well, you know, in a split second situation, blah, and blah, and blah. No, but everybody saw this was no split second situation. You know, this is not, you know, this was a man, you know, 9 minutes, 26 seconds. This is ridiculous. The fact that he stopped the EMT from coming to even help the man because he was dead by then. You know, all of these things, there were just too many physical evidence, testimonial evidence against him. And generally police closed ranks, and police did not close ranks around this. The other thing is generally the attorney general, the prosecution and the police are hand in glove. And that's why you get half-hearted kinds of prosecutions. That did not happen this time. This time, the attorney general and the prosecution, they went out of their way to be seen to be not being biased towards this person. They went out of their way to try and be as transparent as possible. In the vast majority of cases, none of these things are lined up in this way. So this was an unusual case. It could make a difference, but by itself, it does not make a difference at all. By itself, it could be simply seen as a blip. By itself, this man has been sacrificed, Chauvin has been sacrificed in order to allow the vast majority of the system to get on with what it was doing. If we're really going to move forward, you use this, as Biden says, as a way to start something. You don't use it as a way to end something. The appeal stuff, of course, will be popular amongst the Republicans, and there will be scads and scads and scads of money
going to
thrown at this. That's
I
right.
mean, you say that, and I'm reminded that is it Mike Rittenhouse was his surname, the young lad who had a gun in the streets.
Rittenhouse, yeah.
The police were actually found to have funded some of the fundraising activities.
That's right.
But I'm going to go off on a tangent if I continue on that path, because you've just said so much, and Enoch, I'll bring you back in a second. But can I just take you back to something that others might consider granular, but I do not find granular in what you've just said, is the aspect of the police themselves not being on board in this particular case. Yeah. We have a situation where we always have police around. It's not just that one police officer, there are other police officers around those circumstances. And yes, for the most time, they'll defend their colleague who's picked out as the responsible person for that crime. What about in this case? What about those who are around when George Floyd was being killed? And so this is replicated across so many cases. Yeah,
and they're going to be tried, and we'll see what happens with them. Because of course, there was a case of a Black woman police officer who intervened when a colleague of hers was using excessive force. And they fired her. Her department fired her. She has now been reinstated and given her pension and rights, etc. back.
And I think she was imprisoned as well, wasn't she? I think she was imprisoned as well. And I don't know whether it was on the back of that, but she was. I think something happened.
In the meantime, kind of like a couple years later, she's now vindicated. And so I think that oddly enough, may become something that is maybe even more important in certain ways.
Absolutely. Yes, because they have to hold themselves accountable. The public fears the police. So if they can't hold themselves accountable and endorse the misdeeds of their colleagues, then there's no hope for the rest. But I think they should start speaking out. I would want to see a lot more of that. But yes, Enoch, I'm sorry I took over that bit, but I just got carried away with the line of conversation.
No, that's fine. Again, thank you for that, Anita. I think what I want to come to is I wouldn't want to say the historical cases, but we know this has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Do you really think that even though George Floyd's family have had this justice served, there are many families in America right now who are sitting down and wish, I wish it could, it was our family. I wish it was this, we know Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner in New York. Most of these families are now looking. I've had one of Breonna Taylor's family. Basically, she was basically saying, could this open up, kind of like a can of worms, if I say, she's saying she would love to put a case forward. But if we remember previously, the officers involved in Breonna Taylor's death were kind of like acquitted, really, they were not charged. So there are many families at the moment who are trying to rally up together to bring all these cases forward. Do you really think this is possible?
Well, the thing is, I don't know about, you can't retry cases, but the thing is, there are other ways of seeing justice is done. You can have a class action suit, for example, against, somebody, I don't know. We'll see what it is that they want to do. But for me, I think that anytime people organize, it's always good news. Always good news. The more you can organize around things and the more you can get your organizations to hook up with each other, then the more we can actually be moving forward. Because I do think that, all of these deaths, it all adds up, and it must all add up to something that we must never forget, and that actually we must build something progressive from all of this. They're not just dead leaves in the wind, and if these families can kind of come together as an organization, it will not only support each other and support the community, but it just adds to the overwhelming movement of pushing things forward. It is one of the things that I don't see in this country enough. I don't see enough organization. I see is people trying to, the best way they know how, get through things. And that's important, because that's what we all have to do. And I can see that one of the things that's happening is the nature of how we all live. We work all the time. Everybody's working, but we're working to keep roofs over our heads and food in our mouths and raising our kids. But some of the work also needs to be social and political and cultural work. And so that's one of the things that I feel needs to happen here a bit more than what I see.
Thank you very much, Anita. Unfortunately, we're getting to a point where we have to end the show tonight. Really in solidarity with all the families that are mourning at the moment, and also activists in the movement, and people who are trying to bring these issues to light and unpick them for us. We hope that we can speak to you again at some point, probably to look at what next for movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, because there's so much pushback currently and they're criminalized at present. So maybe that's another conversation that we could have. But from the studio, from Enoch, Karimba, Dr. Anita Franklin and myself, good night, and thanks so much for tuning in to African Voices platform on Shepherd Live TV. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.